Hello, and welcome to the first session of David Starkey Members Q&A. First, to thank everybody who submitted questions. They're a really interesting lot, and they've done the most important thing. They've made me think a bit. So let's begin. George in Essex asks, was Mary I, Bloody Mary, as terrible a queen as we've been led to believe? Or is her current reputation largely due to Protestant propaganda? Well, it is indeed largely due to Protestant propaganda, but propaganda isn't always wrong. Mary's, to be rather rude about a woman, is a bit of a mixed bag. She's very much her father's daughter, although she constantly presents herself as her mother's daughter. In other words, daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She is passionately hurt by her father's divorce because, of course, her father divorces when she's a teenager. She experiences the terrible humiliation of being effectively not only bastardized, but turned into a lady-in-waiting on her half-sister, the young Elizabeth, for that brief 3 years when Elizabeth is heir to the throne and Princess of England. It's terrible. It's humiliating. And so much of Mary's life is an act of vengeance, which both powers her, and at the same time, as vengeance often does, I think, it withers you and destroys you. It also makes you a very bad judge of important questions. On the other hand, personally, Mary seems to have been very kind. She loved children. She desperately wanted children of her own. But of course, she is fundamentally, and a fundamentalist Catholic of passionate intensity. She's also, of course, her father's daughter. She only becomes queen because of her extraordinary courage and a degree of military skill. If you remember, immediately after the death of Edward, it looked as though it wasn't going to be Mary who was going to be queen at all. It's Jane Grey, because Edward, quite unconstitutionally, in other words, in defiance of the will of his father, which was also endorsed by Act of Parliament, Edward had unilaterally changed the succession by mere fiat. The document is a very remarkable one. It's called his Device for the Succession, and in some ways, although it's extraordinarily precocious, as he's a very precocious boy, it reads and looks like a kind of crowned Adrian Mole, Edward, aged 14 3/4 or whatever he was. But it looked as though it was going to work by sheer will against this will that all Henry's children inherit. He had forced his councillors, forced the judges to accept it, and Mary was shunted aside, and Jane Grey looked as though she was going to walk to the throne. The imperial ambassador himself takes for granted that Mary's cause is lost. But it wasn't. It wasn't because of her personal courage. She raises troops, and in Framlingham she'd succeeded as part of the inheritance that she'd had in the right of her father's will. She'd succeeded to the vast estates of the Dukes of Norfolk, which had been confiscated, with their headquarters in the great castle of Framlingham. She proclaims herself queen, she marches south, and resistance crumbles, and she receives the submission of the man behind Edward's coup, the Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, at Cambridge, and he humiliatingly has to throw his cap in the air and acclaim the Queen along with the rest. And it's this same courage that preserves her throne, because she comes to the throne in July 1553. In January 1554, there is the Great Conspiracy, led by Thomas Wyatt, the son of the man who probably wasn't Anne Boleyn's, well, certainly wasn't Anne Boleyn's lover in a sexual sense, but had written extraordinary poems about her, the poet Thomas Wyatt. Anyway, his son raises Kent in a Protestant revolt. There's no doubt that Elizabeth somewhere had her finger in the pie, although it's arranged to be carefully deniable. And Wyatt comes within a whisker of taking London, and more importantly, of capturing Whitehall. The Queen is all ready to flee. Her barge is waiting at the Privy Stair to take her to the Tower and to escape abroad. It's within a whisker of abandonment. But once again, she shows extraordinary courage, and she does something else. Even before Wyatt enters this, actually marches round London, even before Wyatt's troops appear at the Thames crossing, what had she done? She turned up at the Guildhall in London, on the hustings. That's the platform where people who were then competing for office in the city, it wasn't Buggins' turn in Tudor England. You actually had to get up there and campaign. The hustings, you to put your case, and she puts her case to the citizens, and it's done magnificently. She has her father's, and indeed her half-sister's, extraordinary ability at public speaking. She's got this fine contralto, rather deep, mannish voice. It's now thought that like the receding hairline and everything else, might be due to the thing that eventually kills her, which is cancer of the optic nerve, the effect on the pituitary gland, and everything else that flows from that. So she shows this extraordinary courage and passion in seizing the throne. And moreover, she then holds the initiative for the first half of her reign. Parliament caves in to the marriage with Philip of Spain. It's very carefully ring-fenced. In other words, the marriage treaties make absolutely clear that although Philip is going to be king, he's what's called the crown matrimonial, but he will be king. He actually takes precedence of Mary. It's the reign of Philip and Mary from the moment of their marriage in July 1554. The Privy Council essentially reports to him. So here we've got then this extraordinary success, and Parliament continues and restores Catholicism. The one thing it won't do is take away the monastic lands from the people who bought them or otherwise acquired them, but pretty much everything else rolls through, and it continues to roll through. Why? Why does Mary fail? She's got her marriage, she's got the throne, she's restored the right religion, and we'll talk a bit, of course, about the methods by which that religion is restored and the persecution of Protestants in a moment. But she's done all these things. She's carried everything before her. Why? Because people thought she was the future. The question of the future is so important. So what turns in Mary's reign isn't to do with her political capacity, it's not to do with her intelligence, it's not to do, really, I think, even with her religious position. The evidence is actually that Protestantism, though there are heroic martyrs, some hundreds of them, for Protestantism is a minority faith. It's quite clear that it had been forced. Certainly the extremer sort of Protestantism of the latter part of Edward's reign is enforced on the English people. They don't want it. So none of these things are why Mary fails, because Mary does fail. The failure is the most intimate, the cruelest. It's her failure to conceive. It's her failure to have a child. If Mary had been able to have a child, even if she died relatively soon afterwards, as she probably would have done, Philip would have been regent. England would have been firmly bound to the Habsburgs. There had been a half Habsburg heir to the throne, and Elizabeth would have been nowhere. She would have been shunted aside. So it is that failure, and it's of course a failure which is profoundly humiliating, because Mary persuades herself that she really is pregnant. there's that extraordinary moment when Cardinal Poole, Reginald Poole, Mary's cousin, and the papal legate in England, and her choice as Archbishop of Canterbury, when he appears in England and is welcomed in England in the latter part of 1554, the King and the Queen completely break precedent there at Whitehall in the great new palace of Henry VIII when Cardinal Poole lands at the Privy Stair. Now, etiquette dictates that the King and Queen should receive the Cardinal, although of course a Cardinal and a papal legate is of very high status. They should receive him in the presence chamber. They don't. They actually go to meet him halfway along the vast length, the 100-yard long Privy Gallery. At that point, I suppose, the longest room in Northern Europe. And halfway along, the King and the Queen on one side and the Cardinal Legate on the other meet. And what does Poole do? He greets her with the words, "Hail Mary, full of grace," the words of the Annunciation. And Mary clutches her belly and thinks she feels the babe stir in her womb. And then there's the extraordinary charade, as it turns out to be, of her pregnancy and her taking to her chamber, that formal ceremonial moment at which you take to your chamber, in other words, that what the Victorians call confinement, in which the Queen retires with her ladies to her bedchamber 6 weeks or so before she's due to give birth, and is not seen again by the male world until the child has appeared. Mary does this at Hampton Court at Easter, about Easter 1555. Well, at Easter time, 1555. Let's get that right. Easter time, 1555. And she actually breaks rules. She stands. Philip is jousting. There's the St. George's Day joust taking place, and Mary actually stands at the window to watch Philip joust. And she stands sideways on, so that her great belly, swollen, we now think, by the problems, the glandular problems that result from her illness, the swollen belly, the swollen breasts and whatever, she stands there so that they can all be seen. And she summons Elizabeth to be present, to witness the humiliation as she is replaced in the succession by this little child. But the little child doesn't come. Mary keens, Mary prays, Mary prostrates herself on the floor. Elizabeth watches sardonically. And finally, Mary slinks out of the palace in the summer, months and months late, after rumours have circulated in London that she'd given birth to a French lapdog or a monkey. And she's laughed at by a beggar in the park. And at that point, now it's clear that she's not going to have a child. Now it's clear there isn't going to be a Catholic heir. The reign turns on a pin's head. She loses control of Parliament. Parliament, above all, will not agree to confiscate the lands of the Protestant exiles, those who fled abroad to escape the burnings and the persecutions. That guarantees failure. That and the survival of Elizabeth. That and the absolute refusal of the English to remove Elizabeth as heir. That's why the Protestant elite, like William Cecil, like Elizabeth herself, can sort of pretend to conform, but effectively withdraws and waits for events to take place. Waits, in other words, for Mary to die. The consequences of this, of course, is a terrible moral judgment on Mary. Those hundreds of deaths are to absolutely no purpose. Eamon Duffy may write enthusiastically, I find shockingly, about the effects of persecution. Yes, persecution does work. By the end of Mary's reign, there are very few people volunteering to be burned, because remember, being burned is a voluntary act. If you renounce your heresy, the church will pardon you. Very few people are coming forward to be burned. But it actually makes no difference, because the future is Elizabeth, and people more and more know it. And moreover, Mary does something else. By her determination for vengeance against the man that she blames more than anybody else for her parents' divorce and for the apostasy of England, that's Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer collapses under the pressure when he's prosecuted for heresy and faces the horror of burning, and he recants. Now at that point, he should have escaped the fire. Mary insists that he shall be burned. She was a fool, because Cranmer, he's put up, as it were, to repeat his recantation on the eve of his fire. You can still see the traces in St Mary's Church in Oxford. You can still see where the platform was erected so as that he could perform this final act of humiliation before his horrible death. But faced with the fire, Cranmer recovers his courage. He renounces his renunciation and he's rushed off to be burned. And at the stake, he famously extends the hand which had signed his recantation. He extends his right hand into the flames, so it's burned before his face. And at that point, Protestantism, which had lost its moral dignity with the collapse of its lay leaders, Protestantism recovers, I think, its moral standing. If Cranmer had died a recanted heretic, if, in other words, reconciled to the church, the moral standing of Protestantism, well, it wouldn't have died, but it would have been so severely injured. Instead, by his heroic martyr's death, he leaves a Protestant legacy that Elizabeth can benefit from and Mary can't destroy. And then finally, of course, and famously, there's not only the failure to alter the succession in England, which leads to the inevitable triumph of Protestantism at home, there is the absolute failure in foreign policy abroad, in which you lose Calais. And it's that double failure, that personal failure to produce an heir, and that absolute humiliation as the last of England's foreign possessions is lost, that enables Mary to be branded both bloody and incompetent. Unfair, but then political judgments are never really fair. It's the winner, and Mary and Catholicism are losers. Now, as you can see, it's a wonderful, wonderful topic. I explored it very fully in my biography of the young Elizabeth, and what I will do, and George, thank you very much for this question, I'll make sure that I do a David Starkey Talks, a proper video on Mary, as one of my very first Tudor videos. So thank you for that.